Good evening, Holmes Road Church of Christ. We're glad you could join us. Welcome back. Glad you could be here on Sunday evening, March the 10th. We're glad that you could join us for the Sunday evening service as we continue to look through the book of 1 Timothy together. Tonight we're in chapter 5. We're looking at verse 1 through 16 tonight. In the previous sections, Paul has instructed Timothy on the kind of person he should be to be a minister. Not all men are called to be ministers in a congregation, and that's what Paul has been instructing him from last week. He's talked about the focus that Timothy should have on his job, what exactly minister does, his exact role, what is the job of a minister. That was all discussed last week. The kind of effort he needs to give in the job. We talked about last week, ministers aren't just, it's not just a clock in 8 to 5, Monday through Friday type job. It's a 24/7 and the max effort that has to be given to that job. The kind of person that Timothy should be in order to be a good minister. That's what Paul talked about a lot last week. And now, having given those instructions on what Timothy needs to do to be a good minister, now in chapter 5 he makes this shift and he begins to talk about how Timothy should treat people in the church. How do you treat all the different groups and all the different dynamics that are in the church? And that's what Paul is going to be giving Timothy instruction on. So let's go and look at verse 1 together as we start with the group of men. Paul writes in 5:1, he says, "Do not rebuke an older man harshly, but exhort him as if he were your father. Treat younger men as brothers." So the first thing, like I said, he takes the first group, and it is the men, to talk about how Timothy as a minister should be treating these men in the church. He says, as a younger man, which Timothy was, he was pretty young in years. He says, as a younger man, the general rule is you shouldn't be rebuking older men. That's a pretty good rule to live by. If you're a younger person, you really shouldn't be chastising or rebuking harshly people who are older than you. Respect the years that presumably, I understand not all older people are just the most wise in the world, but in general, older people have more wisdom and experience, and so therefore, as younger people, you need to respect that. Not that older men are always right and young people are always wrong. That's not what Paul is trying to say here. He's just saying respect the years that someone has on you. And instead of rebuking them, instead of chewing them out, exhort them, encourage them, exhort the men who are older than you. And it's really important to understand that word rebuke, because that's the word here. When he says, do not rebuke an older man harshly, the Greek word here for rebuke is a really important word, and it's the only time in the New Testament this word is actually used. Now you say, well, wait, I've seen Jesus use the word rebuke. And yeah, several times the word rebuke is used in the New Testament. But all those other times it's translated as rebuke. It's a different word than the one used here. The one used here by Paul to Timothy is a hapax. It's the only time this Greek word is found in the Bible. Literally, it means to strike at. This word here, then he says, don't strike out at older people. Now, it wasn't a violent thing. He wasn't talking about don't punch an older man. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about using words. What Paul is really telling Timothy is don't use your words to attack men who are older than you. We all know there are different kinds of ways to correct something. If you see an older person doing something they shouldn't be doing, you don't go into parent mode and shake your finger, start going, now look, you're doing wrong. That you don't treat older people that way. You don't attack. You don't treat them like in any kind of demeaning way. Instead, if you see someone being wrong, you go to them with exhortation. Hey, look, I know you're wiser and older than me. I'm wondering why you're doing this. You treat it with great respect. You treat it with great love. You don't attack someone who's older than you simply because in deference to their years. You treat them with respect as you would your very own father. Now, in our culture today, that may not mean much because I've seen a lot of people really be bad to their fathers. I've seen the role of the father not near as respected as it should be. And a lot of times, people treat their fathers terribly in our culture today. But back in that culture, if you were a son, you did not buck up to your father. You did not rebel. It was a cultural thing. I mean, when dad spoke, you listened. And there's that kind of an honor thing amongst fathers and sons in that culture. And this is what Paul is teaching Timothy. If you're going to treat older men, you need to treat them like you would your father. How would you treat your father if you saw him doing something wrong? You sure wouldn't go up and start rebuking him and pointing your finger at him. He's going to punish you. You would do it with a respectful, loving manner, maybe searching and trying to find out why, and being genuine and asking questions. And you would treat them in a respectful manner, and that's what Paul is trying to teach here. Then he goes to the next group of men, the younger men. And Paul says, when it comes to younger men, treat them as brothers. Don't treat the younger men as fathers. That's how you treat older men. But if there are people that are younger than you, then treat them as brothers. In other words, this word is more in line with the concept of what we think of as partners, or more literal, an equal-footed friend. If I'm older than someone else in the church, I don't look at them as saying, hey, I'm better than you, I'm more respectful, you need to treat me like a father. No. I want to treat them like a partner. It's up to them to treat me if I'm older with the kind of respect, but I don't demand that. If they're younger, I'm going to be treating them as a partner and as an equal. I don't want to use my years of wisdom and experience to lord it over other people. And that's exactly what Paul is saying here. You treat younger people as if they're your partners, as if they are equal to you. Paul is letting Timothy know they do not get the same deference that you would get to the older men. That's how you treat the men in the church. Let's go to verse 2 and look at how Paul instructs Timothy to treat the women. In verse 2, Paul says, older women treat as mothers, and younger women as sisters with absolute purity. Now, I inserted the word treat there because of verse 1. It says treat younger men as brothers, and so I just took that treat down here. But treat older women as mothers and older women as sisters with absolute purity. So now he moves into that section of how to treat women, and basically he says, give older women the respect and the honor that is due them, just like you would give honor and respect to your own mother. Now that means a lot to a lot of us men, because we know how we adore our mothers, right? We appreciate them like no other. And so when Paul is writing Timothy and he says you need to treat older women in your church like you would your very own mother, man, that really speaks to us. We understand that. We appreciate our mothers and value them and honor them, and that's what we need to treat all the older women like in our church. Then Paul goes on to talk about the younger women, and he says, in the younger women, you need to treat them as sisters. Now think for a minute about that brother and sister relationship. I had a sister I grew up with. She's 5 years older than me. I was very close with her when we were growing up. Yes, we had some spats every now and then, but I can't recall ever hitting her and she didn't hit me. We had some fights and some verbal spats. Me and my brothers punched each other and stuff, got in fights, but with the sister is very different. Me and my sister's relationship, we really enjoyed hanging out together and talking. And as a young man, when the opposite sex began to be very attractive, and I never saw my sister that way, right? I mean, that's my sister. You don't look at her in any kind of sexual way. So that's the same kind of thing that Paul is talking here with Timothy. He says, when it comes to the younger women, Timothy, the women in the church, you don't need to try to flirt with them or hit on them. You don't do that with your sister. That's not something you would do with your sister. And that's how you need to treat the younger women in the church, with that kind of respect. You don't use sexual innuendos or double entendres with your own sister, so don't do that with the younger women in church either. You don't try to be provocative with your own sister or show off for her, right? You're just normal, respectful to your sister. You love them. You know, most brothers, they really love their sisters. They try to protect them, and they treat them well, and they want the best for them. And he's saying that kind of attitude is what you need to bring to younger women in the church. So with that being covered now, in verse 1, he talks about the men. In verse 2, he talks about the women. And so both older and younger. And now he gets into verse 3. In verse 3, he says, give proper recognition to those widows who are really in need. So now he brings in that third group. We've talked about the men, we've talked about the women, older and younger in both those cases. Now let's talk about the widows. And he says you need to give proper recognition to widows who are really in need. Now we got to understand that particular culture and in that situation when this verse is written. There were no Social Security programs back then. There were no federal assistance programs from the government. They didn't have welfare baskets or anything. They didn't have people that helped out with the older people. None of that stuff existed. We have a lot of things in place now that actually help with some of the older people, but they didn't have that kind of stuff back then. So therefore, widows were especially vulnerable in that particular culture because they were completely without any support. They generally had no ability to provide for themselves. The older women that became widows, they weren't really able to work or take care of themselves. Their main support was to have a husband. And so if the husband passed and left them away, they were extremely vulnerable. They had no way to take care of themselves. And so here Paul writes to Timothy and he says, it is your job as the minister in the church to honor them, to properly recognize them. In other words, the very clear meaning of this from Paul to Timothy is you need to support them. You need to sustain them. If there is a widow in your congregation and she is in need of food, she's in need of clothes, she's in need of shelter, the church needs to come and help do that because she no longer has a way to support herself. And so therefore it falls to the church to make sure that woman is taken care of and all her needs are provided for. Give them the honor by financially and materially supporting them, making sure they have what they need. Look at verses 4 through 6. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, these should learn first of all to put their religion into practice by caring for their own family and so repaying their parents and grandparents. For this is pleasing to God. The widow who is really in need and left all alone puts her hope in God and continues night and day to pray and to ask God for help. But the widow who lives for pleasure is dead even while she lives. So Paul made the point to Timothy, you need to take care of the widows. But now in this section, verse 4 through 6, he's made clear not all widows need congregational help. Just because they're, quote, widows, it doesn't mean you automatically get qualified to be put on the help list from church. Paul makes it clear that if that widow has family, the family needs to come. It is their responsibility. They're first on the list. They should be the ones that are taking care of this particular widow. Whether they have children or grandchildren, they should be taking care of the widow before the church does. That's step one. The church should only cover the widows, support them, and financially sustain them if they have no family at all, or there's no way that the family can support her. The church doesn't be spending its money on sustaining and helping widows live if they have a family who's willing to take care of them first. But that's not the only criteria. Paul then talks about the widows should be godly women who are acting responsibly. In other words, the church does not need to be supporting a woman who is chasing sinful desires or seeking pleasure or seeking self above God. If there is a widow who is not being faithful, who's not being a godly woman, then the church should not be taking care of them. If the church is going to provide for a widow, she must be the kind of person who's going to put God as her first priority. That is the instruction here. Let's look at verses 7 through 8. In these passages, Paul writes, give the people these instructions so that no one may be open to blame. Anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially for their own household, has denied the faith, and it is worse than an unbeliever. So Paul's instruction to Timothy here is you need to teach it. This is your responsibility. A good minister is going to teach and command these things so that all will know how to handle it. The family, when the grandpa passes away, the family knows what their responsibility is because you have covered it in the congregation. Paul lets us know that God will hold it against those who refuse to take care of their own family members through their own hard work. Paul even goes further to say that God sees that person as an unbeliever, worse than an unbeliever, and so therefore that person was definitely not going to be saved. So Paul is letting Timothy know it's your responsibility to teach this. We don't want anybody on the day of judgment to say, I didn't know I was supposed to take care of grandma because I didn't know that was a teaching from God. I didn't know. I thought the church was going to handle that. Well, that's what the minister should be teaching these things so everybody knows God's concept, and that's what is going on in these verses. Look at verse 9 through 10. In verses 9 through 10, Paul writes, no widow may be put on the list of widows unless she is over 60, has been faithful to her husband, and is well known for her good deeds, such as bringing up children, showing hospitality, washing the feet of the Lord's people, helping those in trouble, and devoting herself to all kinds of good deeds. So Paul gives some interesting instructions here also. You don't just help out every single widow that had a husband die or that had a wife die. You don't help anybody out just because they are in that situation. You have to look at their heart. You have to look at their life. And Paul encourages Timothy here, you only help out those who are older. He says over 60, but the concept here is that younger women, they still have the strength to go out and make it work. They can work. They still have the youth to be able to remarry. A younger woman still has abilities to be able to support herself. The older woman doesn't have those same abilities. That's why you don't help out a younger widow, because they can still take care of themselves. They still have opportunities to find ways to take care of themselves. Paul's instructing Timothy, you only support the ones who do not have the opportunity to provide for themselves because they're got too old or whatever it is. They're too old to remarry. They're too old to take care of themselves, and no family is helping. That's where the church steps in. And only help those widows who have a track record of faithfulness and godly service. Do not help a widow if she did not live her life well or in service to God. That is what Paul is telling Timothy. As a Christian, women have been called to do a job, just as we all have. And service is one of the jobs all of us have to do. And so therefore, Paul is saying, look at their life. If they've been doing a good job being a Christian, they're serving others, they're serving the church, that's who you want to support. But if someone says, hey, look, I want you to support me, and they haven't even been very faithful in the church, they haven't done work for the church, we're not obligated as a church to help that widow. Only support those who answer God's call to be a servant. That's what Paul is saying here. Let's look at chapter 5, verse 11 through 16 now. In 11 through 16, Paul writes to the younger, what do we do with the younger widows? And that's what this one's about. As for younger widows, do not put them on such a list. For when their sensual desires overcome their dedication to Christ, they want to marry. Thus they bring judgment on themselves because they have broken their first pledge. Besides, they get into the habit of being idle and going about from house to house. And not only do they become idlers, but also busybodies who talk nonsense, saying things they ought not to. So I counsel younger widows to marry, to have children, to manage their homes, and to give the enemy no opportunity for slander. Some have, in fact, already turned away to follow Satan. If any woman who is a believer has widows in her care, she should continue to help them and not let the church be burdened with them, so that the church can help those widows who are really in need. So what is Paul's advice to Timothy on how he should minister in a church to younger widows? Well, basically, on the concept of younger widows, Paul's advice is to just say no. You say no to the young widows. We're not helping you. We're not helping you because you still have sensual desires to overcome. That's how the NIV phrases that. I prefer the translation where it says grow wanton. That's some of the older translations say that. I like that phrase because that grow wanton, that's actually pretty close to what the Greek is suggesting here. This Greek phrase, it's really meant to be a metaphor. And it's taken from a metaphor in Greek that refers to a pampered, spoiled horse. If the church supports a young woman, then she can end up growing dependent on that help. And therefore, if she goes dependent on the church always taking care of her all the time, then what motivation does she have to go out and to work or find a job or to take care of herself or to look for a new husband and look for a new family to provide for them as they provide for her. She doesn't have the motivation. If the church is just helping all these young people, then why would they need to go out and work or remarry or whatever the case may be? So Paul is making kind of a logical reasoning here. He's saying you don't need to help the younger widows because it'll become a habit. It'll become a dependent situation. It can result in taking away her desire to marry again as God would want, as God would direct. And that's what Paul's trying to let Timothy know here. When a woman has become idle for too long because she's not working, she doesn't have to work. The church is taking care of her. And so what happens? They become almost bored in their situation. And so therefore Satan will use that boredom, will use that time and attack. And they can lure her into sin, such as going from house to house gossiping. Because what else does she have to do with her time? She doesn't have to work. She doesn't have to invest in a relationship. She just has nothing to do other than get into trouble. And that's what Paul is trying to say here. That is why you say no to supporting the young widows. So Paul here has really addressed 6 different groups of people within the church so far. He addressed the older men, the younger men, the older women, the younger women, and the older widows and the younger widows. And that's what we study tonight. So the question now becomes, how about you? And time to self-evaluate here. I want you to ask yourself tonight, how do I treat the older men? Am I treating them like a father? Am I giving deference to their age? How am I treating the younger men? Am I treating them like my partner? Or am I treating them like I know better than you? Am I treating them like an equal? Or am I lording my wisdom and experience over them, making them feel demeaned? How are you treating the older women? Are you treating them like you would treat your own mother with that kind of love and appreciation? Are you treating the younger women the way you would treat your own sister, with the love and the protection and the well-wishing and wanting them to grow up to be strong women? Are you treating the same way you would with your sister? How are you treating the older widows? Are you honoring them by making sure their needs are met? How about are you treating the younger widows? Are you saying no to them, saying I'm not going to support you, but I am going to encourage you to support yourself and to find another family with which that you can invest and be supported? This is what the Bible is encouraging us to do. Evaluate yourself on all those areas, and that is the lesson for you tonight. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for this lesson. And as we examine ourselves, help us be honest with ourselves on how we're treating other people in the church. And if we need to make a change, help us make a change. Help us always to treat others in the church better than ourselves and be sacrificial and to love others. And all this we ask your help in Jesus' name. Amen. Good night, Holmes Road, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.